My name is Iris Kruijen and I work as a press officer and as a spokesperson for Utrecht University, partly at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine and also partly for the Central Communications Department. So I do a little bit of everything in terms of the topics that I'm working on. But I do speak to journalists on a daily basis, and I also speak to scientists on a daily basis from all different backgrounds. So we're going to talk about how you can best connect with journalists in your work and some tips and tricks on how to do that and how to make it a little bit easier for yourself. So that's the plan. One question that I have for you is if you have a question on the topics that I'm presenting and it's in line with what I'm talking about at that moment, please raise your digital hand to ask your question in the group instead of asking your question in the chat, because that avoids that we have parallel discussions going on and it's a little bit hard for me to keep track of everything at the same time. So preferably ask your question yourself in the meeting or remember it until the end of the presentation and ask it then. I plan to have about 5 to 10 minutes left at the end for all kinds of questions. So that should be enough. A little bit more about myself before we really get into it. I have a background in biomedical sciences myself. I always dreamed to be a scientist, but during my research internships, I noticed that I really preferred talking about research instead of doing it myself. So already for the past 10 years, I've been active as a press officer at various universities and research institutions in the Netherlands, but also abroad. I worked at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory for a couple of years before coming to Utrecht University. So that's enough about me, I guess. I want to start first of all with the why. You as scientists have so much going on, you have so many responsibilities. Why would you also make time for talking to journalists about your work? And why would you put effort into getting media attention for your research results? And because I think your fellow scientists can answer that question even better than I can, I have a couple of videos lined up. And Stefan Kulk is going to tell you why he thinks it's important. Please give me a shout if the audio does not work, but it should.
Hoi, ik ben Stefan Kulk en ik doe onderzoek naar de regulering van online platformen. Als ik het heb over online platformen, kun je denken aan social media zoals Facebook en Twitter. De partijen die inmiddels een behoorlijke invloed hebben op de manier waarop we met elkaar communiceren. Maar je kunt ook denken aan platformen zoals Amazon, die vraag en aanbod bij elkaar brengen. Dus platformen in meer economische zin. Nou, dat zijn allemaal onderwerpen waar geregeld media-aandacht voor is. Ik vind het belangrijk om deel te nemen aan het maatschappelijke debat over platformen, om dat op onafhankelijke wijze te doen. En ik vind het ook waardevol om in begrijpelijke taal mijn onderzoeksbevindingen, mijn inzichten te delen met het bredere publiek. Als je een rapport schrijft voor een bepaalde opdrachtgever of een artikel voor een academisch publiek, dan is je publiek toch wat beperkt. En met zo'n mediaoptreden bereik je een veel grotere groep mensen. En kun je denk ik op die manier ook nog wat teruggeven als het ware aan de samenleving. Ik krijg geregeld LinkedIn-verzoeken van mensen nadat ik een keer op de NOS-website heb gestaan bijvoorbeeld. En ja, dat levert ook weer input op, nieuwe contacten, interacties met mensen. En daarnaast is het ook gewoon heel leuk om te doen. Als je wordt gebeld door een journalist, die heeft een deadline, dus er moet snel gereageerd worden. Dat betekent ook wel dat je even alles aan de kant moet schuiven op zo'n moment. Soms staat de cameraploeg al bijna bij je op de stoep. Dus je moet wel even flexibel zijn. Maar het heeft ook iets heel dynamisch en dat vind ik ook leuk. Het is een beetje anders dan het reguliere werk dat je doet. En ik krijg er ook altijd energie van.
So that was Stefan. And he brings up a couple of really good points, I think. Doing media work is a really good way to enlarge your audience and to make it also a lot more diverse. So you really have the possibility to reach a lot of people, which makes science more open. And I think it's important to share those results. Of course, that's also bringing with it a couple of extra challenges and risks, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. But the potential is just huge. And I think that's a really good thing to consider when you're putting efforts in media work, and also to kind of prepare for, so that you're not surprised by possible follow-up questions and follow-up requests that you might receive. Because as he already mentioned, it's not uncommon for you to get follow-up questions or also like networking requests from other people after you've done media outlets and interviews. Besides that, of course, that provides opportunities not only for new contacts, new networking, but also new grants, new possibilities, new research collaborations. So hopefully it also brings you further career-wise. And in general, but this is a bit more on meta level, I think it's important that scientists, as experts, really have a voice in the public debate, and that you are there to share scientific facts that the public sometimes really desperately is looking for. And again, this can be nerve-wracking, and it comes with its own set of challenges, but the potential is really good. And that's why it's important to really consider this, and if you want to do it, to prepare for it. Because it's not something that's a supernatural thing to do. It can make people really nervous. It still makes me nervous, and I've been doing this for 10 years. So my main message throughout this whole presentation will be carefully consider if you want to do it, and if you want to do it, take some time to prepare, because that will really make the end result so much better, and it will also make you feel better about the whole interaction. And then you will also notice that the more you do it, the easier it gets. Practice makes perfect, and you'll actually be able to have some fun with it. And I hope that's also something that you got from Stefan's little quote. He does it quite regularly. He now kind of understands the game and how it works. And if you do that, and if you have insight into that, it really allows you to make use of your media connections as well, and to really, go for the best result. So then, if you decided that you want to do this, how do you do it best? Again, we also have another researcher telling you about their experiences.
Ik ben Lonneke IJsseldijk. Ik werk bij de afdeling pathologie van de faculteit diergeneeskunde, waar ik onderzoek doe naar aangespoelde zeezoogdieren. Een onderzoek naar gezondheidsstatus van die dieren en bijvoorbeeld de bedreigingen waar de populaties mee te maken hebben. Ik profileer mezelf door middel van bijvoorbeeld social media, maar ook mijn profielpagina is belangrijk. Ik vraag altijd partners om mij en de faculteit diergeneeskunde in hun berichten te taggen. En op LinkedIn en op Instagram post ik bijvoorbeeld vaak mooie foto's of nieuwtjes. En daar weten mensen me ook altijd te vinden. Je merkt ook dat hoe vaker je bijvoorbeeld in de media bent gekomen, dat journalisten, maar ook stakeholders weten wie je bent en dus een volgende keer ook makkelijker bij je terechtkomen. Ik onderhoud relaties met bijvoorbeeld partners door ze altijd op de hoogte te houden, zodat ze zich geïnformeerd en betrokken voelen. En met journalisten bijvoorbeeld, dan wil ik wel eens de contactgegevens opslaan van een journalist waar ik bijvoorbeeld al eerder heel prettig mee heb samengewerkt. Zodat ik ze in het vervolg, als ik een nieuwtje heb of een nieuwe publicatie uitkomt, een primeur kan geven. Dan overleg ik met ze dat ze een interview kunnen afnemen en daar een artikel van kunnen schrijven. Er is altijd snelheid bij natuurlijk, dus dan maken we afspraken over hoe lang ik denk nodig te hebben. Maar daartegenover vraag ik ook altijd of ik wel mijn quotes kan nalezen, zodat ik zeker weet dat wat er staat, dat dat ook klopt. En dan is het ook belangrijk om vaktermen wel een beetje te vermijden en zoveel mogelijk te praten in een taal die eigenlijk voor het algemene publiek begrijpbaar is. Het kost me ongeveer niet meer dan een uur in de week om bijvoorbeeld de social media, mijn LinkedIn of mijn profielpagina up-to-date te houden. Persberichten schrijven of de website updaten, daarvoor vraag ik altijd hulp van mijn collega's bij de afdeling marketing, communicatie en multimedia. Dus dat scheelt dan mij wel heel veel tijd. Wat meer tijd kost zijn bijvoorbeeld dingen als tv-uitzendingen en daaraan meewerken. Natuurlijk gebeurt dat maar 1 of misschien enkele keren per jaar. Maar voor een grote documentaire kan je zo een dag of enkele dagen aan het filmen zijn. Natuurlijk betekent het wel een grote zichtbaarheid, dus alles is wel een beetje wat dat betreft meer in verhouding.
That was Lonneke. She really does a lot of media work around her research and has a lot of experience. And I think she starts with a good first point. If you want to be found, make sure that you can be found and that journalists can find you. When they are working on an item or a story, whether that's for radio, television, or the newspaper, they use Google as well, just like all of us. And they will just Google for a certain field of expertise with the word research. So make sure that your profile page or your social media channels really tell what it is that you're an expert in, first of all. But also make sure that, for example, if you have multiple last names or that the spelling of your name can cause some confusion, make sure that you use the exact same name everywhere. That's also an important thing. It sounds super trivial, but we see it quite a lot that there's confusion around these simple things. A professional photo can really immediately show that you are a kind of outward thinking scientist and that you're open to talk to people. And the same is true for sharing media items that you're proud of. This can immediately give journalists a sense of, okay, this person has already worked with a journalist before, so probably my interaction with them will be a little bit easier because they already kind of know what to expect. And it also allows you to really filter which items that you are happy with. Hopefully that will help you attract the journalists that you want to collaborate with as well. Some other really interesting things for journalists, that if you speak multiple languages, that's really good to know. Not only for journalists, but also for the press officers at your institute, because that way they can pitch you to journalists in various countries. And it's always useful if you share your mobile number with your press officer. They will never share this with a journalist without asking, but it allows your press officer to contact you quickly when there are media questions coming in that you might be able to answer. And only after checking with you will they give it to the journalist. So, and I think especially in this context, that's an important thing to mention and to talk about, because I can imagine that not all of you want to be found on all of your expertises. Animal research is still a tricky topic and it's prone to miscommunications and people have really strong feelings about it. So really think about what you want to be found on and what not, because your communications department or your press officer can also help you in the other case. If you do not want to be found, they can, for example, help you remove contact details from certain pages, or help you if you get weird messages or things like that. Of course, that's also important in this context. Two other things that Lonneke mentions is, her personal connections. She really uses the journalist connections that she's had in the past, and she gives them a scoop in the future. So, journalists are just normal people, just like us, and they really like it if you come back to them after a certain period of time and share your news with them yourself. They actually prefer that from having a press officer in between. But of course, it depends on your research topic if that's suitable or not. And yeah, it takes time. That's also something Lonneke made quite clear. Depending on what exactly it is that a journalist is asking, a media question can take you 10 minutes when it's just a quick phone call, or it can take you hours or even days when you're talking about a television documentary. These can be really time intensive. So that's also always something to consider. But usually the potential outreach is also bigger if you invest more time. But yeah, something to discuss with your press officer and with the journalists themselves. You also need to make it workable for you with all the other stuff that you have going on. So now I wanted to check, maybe there are already some questions about what you heard, what Stefan said, what Lonneke said, what I said. If you want to discuss something in a little bit more detail, please raise your hand to ask your question now. And if there are no questions yet, of course, we can continue. So I'll just give it a few more seconds. But if there's nothing there, then we just go on. And again, feel free also in the meantime, if you have a question, just raise your digital hand and ask it. That will make the discussions more interesting. Okay, I do see a question. Stefan, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there's a big difference between what we would call old media and new media and how you approach that.
With new media, do you mean social media, or what do you mean with new media?
Yeah, I think social media, but also new forms such as podcasts and things like that. Well, maybe that's not really new anymore, but TikTok, whatever.
Yeah, okay. And maybe one distinction to talk about for old versus new is there was always a lot of time pressure on journalists and on journalism, so they always have to work fast. And this has always been a conflict with scientists because science usually takes a long time and it can be hard to kind of summarize all of that into a quick and fast media interview. But with the new media where we're more online, more is going via social media, that's become even quicker. So I think the timelines of journalists are even shorter and they are working on even more stories per day than they were 10 years ago. And this is, as a scientist, I think something to be very aware of, that the timescales of science and journalism are completely different. So journalists are always in a rush. That doesn't mean that you also have to be in a rush when you're working with them, but the main thing is they need to know quickly if you can or cannot help them. That's something to remember. And then you also mentioned podcasts. I agree. I think already they're kind of part of the normal media landscape. So for me as a press officer and for my colleagues, I really noticed that we already take them into account as like a normal thing besides television and radio. The nice thing about podcasts is that they're usually a little bit less news focused and a little bit more, they allow for more background information. So they really allow you to tell a story in more detail. And yeah, you just have more space. So they offer a really interesting platform, I think, for science, because they really allow you to talk about the real, the way science works, basically. That it's not just, okay, we had this question, we did a study, and this was the result. But a podcast can really give you the chance to talk about like the whole path that led to your results in the end, to also talk about the challenges you had, to also talk about the things that are still not clear. You know, it offers you the chance to give a look into the gray area of science and to show that it's really not all so black and white, if you know what I mean. So I think it's a super interesting platform. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Monique, you also have your hand raised.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to that. I think the biggest challenge nowadays is still Twitter, because it goes so fast and it tends to be rather negative sometimes. So I think if you want to be really active on Twitter about animal research, I would recommend you to contact the communications department, because it can be done very well. But yeah, you have to know what to do, especially when you get many negative reactions, and then people can help you with that. Sometimes you can simply ignore it and it will pass over. And sometimes you can react factual and how you say that, de-escalating. But a bit of help there could be useful, I think.
I also have a little bit more information about this specifically, like social media and the comments that you can get from random people in the outside world towards the end of the presentation. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail later. Okay, any other questions for now? I don't think so. Then we go on with the first little exercise of this workshop. I want to challenge you to prepare a short pitch about yourself and your research of 20 seconds. And this is not some random time frame, but it's about the time frame that you would also have in a radio interview, for example, to kind of introduce yourself and tempt the listener to stay tuned in and to listen to the rest of your story. So that's why the time limit is there. The main thing here is to really keep your introduction short and sweet. So use the 20 seconds that you have and tell a little bit about your research in this. So I'm going to give all of you about 3 minutes to think about this. Just write some bullet points down on paper. And then, yeah, in 3 minutes, I'll be back online and then we can talk further. So the 3 minutes start now. So that was about 3 minutes. I hope you were all able to put down a few bullet points. We are with a lot of people in this meeting, so I can imagine that it's not the best place to ask someone to do their pitch before the whole group. So what I want to do is as follows. I want you all to do your pitch, but of course without turning your microphone on. So just practice it for yourself in front of your computer. I'm going to do a little countdown and then the time starts. And I'm going to say stop when 20 seconds are over. And then we can see which of you were able to do your pitch in time and who not, and we can discuss a little bit further what the challenges are of this. Okay, so I'm going to count down. Please do this. I know it's awkward, but please practice your pitch in front of your computer with your microphone off. And then I'm interested to hear how it goes. Okay, countdown. 3, 2, 1, start. Stop. That was 20 seconds. It's short, but at the same time, it's long when you start talking. So now I'm super curious, and I want to ask you, all of you who used less time than 20 seconds or more, so if you didn't fit it in 20 seconds, please raise your hand, and then hopefully you can see how hard it is to do this right in the first try. Raise your digital hand if you did not fit it exactly in 20 seconds. Yeah, I see someone in the chat saying, I think I used 10 seconds. This is really one of the challenges when you're on the radio. Thanks all for raising your hands. You can put it down now. This is really one of the challenges when you're on the radio. Kind of when you get a little bit nervous, you lose track of time in some way, or at least that's what always happens to me. And I hear this a lot from scientists who talk on the radio. And it can be really hard to think of yourself talking and register how long you've been taking. And that is why it's so important to practice. You can see now if you did or did not fit the information that you wanted to share in the time frame that you got. So you can either add a little bit more or cut it down a little bit, because if you get a certain time frame, use it. It's a waste of the seconds if you use less time than you got. And if you use way more time, then yeah, that's also, of course, not really nice to listen to when you're tuned in on a radio and someone just keeps talking and talking and adding way too much detail. So practicing is a great way to get a better feeling for this. And there's also really some key elements that make a pitch more or less interesting besides the time aspect. I really hope that all of you thought about the so what element in your pitch. So I do research on XYZ. Why is that important? Why is it relevant for the people listening to the radio? And for some research, this is an easy question to answer because the results can and will benefit society. Sometimes this is quite a hard question to answer. In that case, you can see if maybe a personal touch can add that element into the story. So you could talk, for example, about why you particularly are so interested in this topic that you decided to spend your professional career researching it. And it's also really this personal touch that makes it interesting for listeners to listen to you. You share a little bit about your life and your interests and why, this is something you want to spend your time on. Let's see. I saw some things in the chat, but these are all your seconds, are really good. 18, 22, 19, that's really, really impressive. All right. If there are no further questions on the pitching so far, then I continue, but I'll just wait for a few seconds to see if anything else pops up. No, then we continue. What do journalists want? And we asked a journalist to answer this question for you. So now we're going to listen to an editor from the show News and Co. Let me just check if it's still working.
Mijn naam is Jeff. Ik ben senior redacteur bij het programma De Nieuwsbv van BNN-VARA op Radio 1. Dat is eigenlijk heel breed. We zijn in principe overal in geïnteresseerd. Wat je voor ogen moet houden is maatschappelijke relevantie. Wij kijken altijd of het A, duidelijk uit te leggen valt, hè, dus niet te veel jargon. En B, steekt de luisteraar er wat van op. Bijvoorbeeld is een onderzoek naar beeldvorming van de politie en criminaliteit. Daar zeg ik gelijk een vinkje bij. Onderzoek naar het recyclen van plastic. Dat hangt er maar vanaf. Daar zijn zoveel publicaties over dat het wel iets heel bijzonders moet zijn. Willen wij daar nog iets mee doen? Hoewel het heel erg bij het profiel van mijn omroep past. Een onderzoek naar laat-middeleeuwse teksten. Nou, dat is jou zeker in eerste instantie zeggen van nou, dat is echt niet interessant voor ons. Maar stel de wetenschapper in kwestie kan een lijntje leggen naar de taal van nu. Bijvoorbeeld de straattaal van tegenwoordig. Is daar een link te leggen? Dan wordt het ineens weer wel interessant. Het is niet zo dat wij het liefste met de bekende mensen werken, hè, de Erik Scherders van deze wereld. Nee, wij zijn juist geïnteresseerd in jonge, enthousiaste wetenschappers die graag hun verhaal doen. En dat is vaak voor een onderwerp al driekwart van het werk. Het enthousiasme van de verteller. We houden altijd een uitgebreid voorgesprek met iemand. Voor ons is het belangrijk om te kijken, is die persoon iemand die goed kan praten? Kan hij onder woorden brengen wat wij, zoals wij dat graag willen? En voor de wetenschapper zelf is het van belang om te weten, oké, is dit programma wel echt geïnteresseerd in mijn onderwerp? Hou vooral heel goed contact met jullie eigen voorlichting, want wij hebben goed contact met hun. Heb geen schroom en je zult merken dat een gesprek met een journalist buitengewoon aangenaam kan zijn. Go for it.
I really love this last piece of advice that he offers, like, don't be afraid for journalists, just go for it. I of course completely agree with him, but I'm also fully aware that it can be nerve-wracking to do this, especially if you haven't done it very often before. But I want to just recap a couple of things that he said. First of all, that the societal relevance of a study or research should always be clear in the interview, and luckily they do these pre-interviews before the actual interviews to find out together what the interesting angles are, what you can talk about, what you cannot talk about. And this is not only how the News BV works, they're a super pleasant show to work with, but most radio shows and also television shows work like this. And actually also a lot of newspapers now also do these short pre-interviews to see if the expert can really tell them about the questions that they want to ask in their article. So this is good to know for you, that you don't immediately have to jump into the deep end, but that you have this pre-interview before. Then they are not looking for the next Erik Scherder. They just want to speak to enthusiastic researcher that can talk about their work with passion, and really that's half of the item. So if you, if you can share that enthusiasm, then for a journalist, that's really already an important tick, an important plus next to your name. So don't be afraid to share also a little bit of your personal, enthusiasm or the reason why you got into this research in the first place. It's really these little elements that make researchers more human, journalists are looking for these. So if you feel comfortable sharing that kind of information, then please do so, because it makes it more interesting to talk to you. And of course, and that's the last thing I want to highlight, he said, the way you explain your research is also really important. You have to avoid jargon, really use language that's easy to understand, that everyone can follow. And when you're used to talking to your fellow scientists most of the time, then this can be quite a change in your way of speaking. And again, this is just something that gets better the more you practice it. So if you have ever an important media interview coming up, practice it, and preferably practice it with some people in the room so that they can tell you, okay, here you lost me. This word, please don't use it again because I don't understand what it means. Because you're so into your own topic, it can be hard to detect jargon, but other people can detect it really easily for you. So here it's really helpful to work together, and preferably with people who are not inside your area of expertise as well, but maybe just a friend, a neighbor, or a family member. That could be super helpful. Then I want to talk about your windows of opportunity for proactively, pushing your research out there. And there are basically two options. Either your research is the news because you have a new publication that you're publishing in a scientific paper, your PhD defense is coming up, you have a new collaboration or a new piece of equipment that you can share, that you can talk about. So in these type of moments, you can really collaborate with your communications department to, for example, prepare a press pitch or a press release, and to really attract some journalists and hopefully tempt them to talk about this. Or you look at what else is going on in the world and you see if you can tie your research into the public debate that's ongoing at that point in time. So for example, actually in recent months, there's been a lot of opinion pieces, for example, on the use of animals in research. For many of you, and maybe some of you have been involved in these opinion pieces, that can be a chance for you to pitch yourself and your expertise to some journalists and to take part in that discussion. So it really goes two ways, and it's good to be aware of all these opportunities. Maybe a good moment again to ask if there are questions about anything that Jeff said in the video or anything that I said in the last couple of minutes. Feel free. If not, then we continue with this. If you don't have journalist contacts yet, it can be kind of daunting, like how do I reach out to a journalist? And it's quite easy. Probably your institute has press officers, just like Utrecht University, and they have journalist contacts, and they can help you connect with the journalists that are interesting for you. So please collaborate with your press office, and they can, really search for super expertise journalists or a little bit more broad journalists that are covering all types of news. They can also identify newspapers versus radio versus podcast. And that really allows you to make a selection of journalists that can really cover your story the best. Because not every story is meant for every journalist. And if you pitch a story that's super difficult and tricky and sensitive to a journalist that usually never covers science, I would say that's not really a great match. So this is really something to think about, and it's really best if you do that together with your press officer and make a little press plan for the news that you want to put out there. And of course, if you do already have some journalist contacts and you have some nice collaborations in the past, use these contacts and reach out to them again with your next story. Because for the journalist as well, it's nice to hear from you again. They will feel kind of honored if you reach out to them directly. And because they covered the topic before, you know that they will be interested in the theme in general. And yeah, you might be able to collaborate with them again. And in building a good relationship with journalists, one thing that's always important is speed. I already talked about that a little bit. And that doesn't mean that you have to jump into every media, to every interview request immediately. You always can take some time to prepare, and I think you should. But for a journalist, it's super important to hear as soon as possible if you can or cannot help them. Because if they know that you're going to help them and that you can provide them with an interview later in the day, they can stop looking for their expert on that topic. Because they know they got you and that you will help them. And if you don't let them know, they will just continue looking because they have a lot of time pressure on their story. And chance is really big that they will have found somebody else in the meantime if you only respond a couple hours later. So this happens quite a lot. And I think it's good to be aware of this, that you can already say, yes, I'm going to help you, and still build in enough time to prepare and to take your time to do a little bit of additional reading, I don't know, so that you can do the interview well prepared and not over hastily. And maybe, you know, the answer is no, and you cannot help them with this specific request. Maybe then you can help them with referring the journalist to a trusted colleague or to some other background information that they can use for their story. It's really nice if you really think along with them on the topic and see how you can, you know, guide them into the right direction or to more and better information. They will always appreciate that. All right, so now imagine the situation that your phone rings and it's a journalist or it's your press officer asking if you want to collaborate on a certain type of interview. Do not immediately say yes or no, but first ask some follow-up questions to really see if this request fits you and your expertise or not. Who is the journalist and at which medium do they work? So you can just Google them really quickly. If you do not have time for this, your press officer can do it for you. That's our job, so you never have to feel weird about asking us to do that. And you can see what kind of topics they covered before. Did they do that in a good or in a bad way? And does it make you feel comfortable to work with them or not? If you see that they have made a lot of bad stories, then, you know, that's a good reason to say, no, I'm going to pass on this request. What is the topicality? So why are they talking about this now? There might have been an incidence of something in the world which made them talk about this now, and it's always good to know what the underlying reason is. And what do they want from you precisely? Sometimes a journalist is calling for background information that will not necessarily be used with your quote and your name in a piece. And sometimes they really want you to provide quotes and you know that you will be mentioned as a person and with your expertise. So there's a big difference, and it's good to know what to expect so that you do not get disappointed if you don't find your contribution anywhere. Who else are they interviewing? This is also an important question, especially in, for example, TV shows. We see quite often that in talk shows, I mean, that they put an expert on a topic, a scientist, versus just a normal citizen with no professional career or background on the topic. And then, you know, they let them hash it out. For a scientist, this is really a tricky situation because you have facts versus emotion, and usually that's not really food for the best discussion. So I always advise scientists to not go into a talk show like that, because it will be really hard to share your professional scientific results in a setting like that. That's why it's good to know who else they're interviewing. And it's not only for TV shows, but for example, also for a large interview in the newspaper, for example. What's the deadline? So do you need to respond today, or is it also okay if you do that tomorrow or in a couple of days? And then, yeah, once you know all that information, you can really make an informed decision on if you want to work with this journalist or not, and you can possibly plan your interview. It's always good if you inform your press officer, so they know what's going on. They know that, you know, they can be available to help you. You can, for example, do a little prep interview with your press officer beforehand, but maybe you're experienced and you don't need all of that. Then still it's good to inform your press officer, because they can keep an eye on the results and, for example, share it on the university's social media channels when the interview is out. Two final points. You can always ask to see your quotes before publication. In the Netherlands, this is done on a regular basis and most journalists are okay with it, but it's not something that you can demand. And especially outside of the Netherlands, actually, it's basically not done to ask for this, because there the rules of journalism are slightly different, and journalists really feel like they lose their objectivity when they allow you to also have a say over the text. So there's this is a little bit different per country. In the Netherlands, you can ask it, and we often do, and usually journalists are okay with this. So it's something that you can bring up in your agreements before you actually do the interview. And of course, you can always say no to a request as well. But this is a really gray area. Don't be too humble either. We see quite a lot, especially with young scientists, that they tend to feel like they don't know enough about a certain topic to talk about it in the media, in the press, and that they keep referring to their more advanced colleagues who are, for example, already the professors. It's not always necessary that you really know everything, that you are the absolute expert on a topic before you can talk about it on a radio show, for example. That's not the depth of expertise that they're looking for, because usually the questions that they want to ask are not that super specific either. They're a little bit more on the general level. So always think about it well and don't say no too quickly, but it is always an option. I was talking for a long time again, so let me just check if anyone wants to ask something. No, then we go quickly onwards. I would always advise you, if you have an interview coming up, to really prepare your key message for that interview, whether it's radio, television, or a written article. Really think about what do you want to share and what should the reader or the listener remember after, listening to your part of the interview. And you should be able to summarize that in 3 bullet points. And again, avoid jargon, make it a little bit more personal, a little bit more specific by adding examples or numbers or anecdotes from your personal life, and make sure it's not too long, but that it's kind of in this little time frame that you could do in about 20 seconds per key message. I have an example of a key message. We want to improve the health of purebred cats and dogs, and then some bullets to enrich that key message, mainly an anecdote from this veterinarian's professional life, a fact with some numbers in it that's quite catchy and easy to remember, and a soundbite. A soundbite is kind of a short and snappy sentence that grabs the attention and that people will hopefully remember because it kind of triggers their emotions, or it triggers them in a good way. And I see that time is going so very quickly. I think it's really good for all of you to practice preparing a key message, but I think that right now we don't have enough time to really go into this. So please remember or write down these elements of the key message that I just discussed. And maybe after today, somewhere in the upcoming weeks, try and take 15 minutes somewhere to think about this. Prepare a key message around your most recent publication or a publication that you have coming up, something that you would like media attention for. Try and draft a key message like the one I just showed you. And of course, I'm happy to share these slides with all of you afterwards so that you can look back into it. And then you will be already a few steps ahead when a media request comes in the future, and you can then define your key message further when the opportunity really comes along. But I think for now, time is just too tight if we want to keep some time for questions. Because this is also an important part of the presentation that I want to share with you, the Woops. The potential audience that you reach through the media and through social media is huge. And unfortunately, in this day and age, that also means that you will probably get some negative reactions. And that's what I want to talk about for a bit by sharing the example of one of our researchers who experienced the same.
This was the stupidest article I've ever read in the Washington Post, which is truly saying something.
Nou ja, ik wist wel, ook uit ervaring, dat mensen daar in eerste instantie wat van schrikken. En ik wist ook daarnaast van het spreken in andere contexten, dat mensen die niet een geesteswetenschappelijke studie hebben gekozen, daar nog wat meer van kunnen schrikken. In het begin was het een beetje een soort van even paniek van jeetje, wat gaat er nu als volgende gebeuren? Dat was het vooral steeds. Het Twitter-account van de Universiteit Utrecht, dus niet alleen van geesteswetenschappen, humanities en ons departement dat zeg maar op Facebook zetten, dat er heel veel mensen van ja, maar dit is toch geen wetenschap en wat hebben jullie voor rare mensen in huis? Nou, ik heb er geen spijt van dat ik het stuk heb geschreven. Ik denk niet dat ik het beter niet had kunnen doen. Ik denk nog steeds met, nou ja, misschien enige arrogantie, maar dat we meer van dit soort discussies nodig hebben en niet minder. Eerst krijg je de mensen die zich heel erg nou ja, geprikkeld voelen, maar meestal ook gewoon een week later het alweer vergeten zijn. En die willen en mensen die het willen gebruiken omdat ze denken, haha, hier heb ik een mooi, weet je wel, hier heb ik een stok om iets mee te slaan voor eventjes. Maar dan gaat het weer voorbij. En op de lange termijn krijg je steeds mensen die zeggen, ach joh, ik laat mijn studenten nu, ik laat mijn middelbare scholieren, laat ik jouw stuk lezen. Je had zo'n leuk stuk over The Lion King geschreven. Of kom bij ons op school praten over, wil je bij ons komen praten over Disney? En precies dat soort dingen kunnen we inzetten om onze studenten wat mondiger en wat mediakritischer te maken. Op het moment dat je je in dat publieke debat wat meer begeeft, met bijvoorbeeld een opiniestuk, dat je dat dus ook doet niet vanuit een soort van, oh, ik ben Jort Kelder en vind hier iets van, ook al weet ik er niks van. Maar ik kan een prikkelend idee aandragen of een prikkelende opinie aandragen die gebaseerd is op een academische traditie en lang nagedacht en gereflecteerd hierop.
Yes, so that was an example from a couple of years ago, which really got quite intense, and it got worldwide media coverage and social media messages from all over the world. But as you can already hear, after the first kind of phase of panic and being startled, in the end, Dan really ran with this, and it's now also part of his Twitter bio, where he actually says, writer of the most stupid article in the Washington Post ever, with quotation marks. I think it's really cool that he looks back on it in this way, because of course it was super intense for him to all of a sudden be in the middle of a media storm and a social media storm. But that's the thing with these storms, they blow over, and they blow over quite fast, even though when you're in the middle of it, it really doesn't feel that way, and it can be quite scary. So, of course, I hope this will not ever happen to any of you, but if it does, try and remain calm. It will blow over, and in the meantime, your communications department can definitely help you with this. If you're really receiving too many weird or intimidating messages, we're there to assist, and there are a couple of possibilities. If you're working at UU, please have a look at the intranet page that I'm sharing on the screen, because that shows you all the types of support that we have available on this topic. And I know that currently it's a topic that a lot of institutions in the Netherlands are working on, because unfortunately it happens more and more that scientists have to face this when they show their expertise in the public debate. So hopefully there's also something being set up at your institution. But yeah, still in a really short time, I want to share some tips and tricks with you. When you get a lot of bad messages on social media, usually you can divide them into 3 categories, and these are the actions that we would advise in the 3 categories. So you have the really angry people that are basically just showing their anger, and that your research does not make any sense to them, and that they kind of hate you for just doing your research. It's probably best to ignore and block these people via the options that you have available on the specific channels, because going into a discussion with them usually really costs a lot of energy and doesn't really give you a lot back. Usually these people are so much in their anger that there's not really a normal conversation possible. So ignore or block is usually the way to go. But if you want to respond to them because, you know, you just want to, and I can also imagine that you want to tell people how this makes you feel, then that's usually a good way to enter this conversation. It's a way where you can really get people to get back to their senses by saying, you know, hey, do you realize how this message makes me feel? Sometimes this will open up an opportunity for an actual interaction with some depth, but not always. So don't be, you know, don't be let down if that doesn't happen. But yeah, then you have the crazy who are just talking nonsense. You can't really understand what the point is that they're trying to make. And yeah, there's just quite a lot of confused people on social media. And again, here the best strategy really is to ignore and or to block them so you don't have to see the messages anymore. Then there's a very dark category, that's the dangerous. That's the people who actually send out threats and intimidations where they say that they're gonna do something to hurt you or hurt people around you. With these messages, it is possible to report them, to press charges. Here at UU, we are here to help you with that, and we can go to the police together. And I think for many institutions, that's the same. So with these kind of messages, it's really important to take action because people cannot just threaten you and get away with it, even if it's just a Twitter message. That's really kind of disturbed. So one last slide that I wanted to share with you. This is way too much information, but there's also a good amount of tips and tricks available on this topic online. And one really good website is Troll Busters. You can see it on the bottom right. Not all of these columns will be relevant to you, but some of them are. So I would advise you, if you're interested in this topic, to go to that website and have a look around. And yeah, I didn't want to end on the very negative note of online intimidation. So this final slide is a bit more general. In good and in bad times, please remember that your communications department is there to help you with anything press related, whether that's to reach out to journalists, to prepare a press release, but also to help you with messages coming in after you did a media interview, and maybe not all of those messages are pleasant. So make sure that you know who they are, make sure that they know who you are and what you're working on so that you can find each other when the time is right. And yeah, I think these bullet points speak for themselves, so I'm not going to repeat them. We covered a lot of ground in just 1 hour, and there are a couple of minutes left for questions.